Right, in this video, we're going to find the 6 trig functions for real numbers, okay? In this case, number 1, it's 3 pi over 4. And problem 2, it's negative 5 pi over 6, okay? In the previous video, in part 1 of this video, we determined the 6 trig functions for those special values that were either, on the x-axis for our terminal side, on the y-axis for our terminal side, or one of those special values that you've come to know really well as we're learning the unit circle, okay? So if we're not using, one of these angles or one of these values, one of these real numbers that are in quadrant 1 or on the positive x or y axis, then one of the things we need to do is determine a reference number, okay? Or if you have the unit circle memorized, and one of these special values occurs, you should be able to determine the terminal point that's associated with this real number, okay? So if you're not comfortable with reference numbers, you might want to go back and watch that video again. If you don't have the unit circle memorized, you're going to have to come up with a way to determine what the terminal point is for these real numbers first, okay? So I'm going to use reference numbers here. So 3 pi over 4, the reference number is pi over 4, which is going to lead me to this terminal point. But before I use that, I need to make sure I know, what the signs are, the SIGN of the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate may be, okay? So 3 pi over 4 is just shy of 1 pi. This is like 3/4 is 0.75 pi. So this is going to be in quadrant 2, okay? And in quadrant 2, I know that the x-coordinate is negative and the y-coordinate is positive. So I'm going to use these values for my x and y coordinates, but I just need to understand that x is going to be negative because I'm in quadrant 2, okay? Now, once I know the x and y coordinate, I can determine the values of the 6 trig functions using, these values that you learned in the previous video, okay? Sine is y, cosine is x, tangent is the ratio y over x, cosecant is the ratio 1 over y, secant is the ratio 1 over x, and cotangent is the ratio x over y. So don't forget those, okay? So the sine then of 3 pi over 4 is just going to be this y-coordinate, radical 2 over 2. The cosine of 3 pi over 4 is just going to be this x-coordinate, negative radical 2 over 2. And the tangent is going to be the ratio y divided by x. We've got a positive divided by a negative. They have the same value other than that. So tangent's going to be negative 1, okay? Sine, again, is 1 over y, or it's the reciprocal, cosecant is 1 over y, or the reciprocal of sine. So we would get radical 2 when we simplify that. Secant, we're going to flip this and then simplify that. It's going to be negative radical 2. And cotangent is just x divided by y, which also gives me negative 1. Okay, so that's the 6 trig functions for the value or real number t equals 3 pi over 4. Okay, so determine a reference number, determine what quadrant that this value lies in, and then determine the terminal point. Once you do that, it's pretty basic, except for maybe a little bit of simplifying and rationalizing denominators if there's a radical there, okay? T, negative 5 pi over 6. Our reference number is going to be pi over 6. So I'm going to use these values for x and y. But then the question you need to ask yourself, where does this value lie? What quadrant? And that's going to be in quadrant 3, okay? So in quadrant 3, we're going to use these values, but they're both going to be negative. Okay, so that's going to be the ordered pair I use to determine the 6 trig functions for this real number, okay? So again, hopefully you're getting better and better at this. So I'm going to start to go through these a little more quickly. Sine is just going to be negative 1/2, the y-coordinate. Cosine is the x-coordinate. Okay, tangent, we're going to divide y by x. All right, we're going to have to do a little simplifying there. And when we do, we're going to get a positive because it's negative divided by negative. And then once I clear everything up, it's going to be radical 3 over 3. Okay? Cosecant is going to be the reciprocal of sine here, negative 2. Secant, we're going to flip this again. It's 1 over x, so we're going to flip that and simplify. So I get negative 2 radical 3 over 3. And then cotangent is going to be the reciprocal of tangent, or x divided by y, which just gives me a radical 3, okay? So that's the 6 trig functions for the real number, negative 5 pi over 6. Okay, let's do a couple more. So number 3 here, t is 5 pi over 3. So my reference number, t bar, is going to be pi over 3. All right, 5 pi over 3 is really close to 2 pi, okay? So that gets me into quadrant 4, okay? So let's scroll up here and look at pi over 3. Pi over 3, my x-coordinate's going to be, plus or minus 1/2. My y-coordinate's going to be plus or minus radical 3 over 2. And which quadrant this lies in is going to tell me which one's positive, which one's negative, okay? So because I'm in quadrant 4, x is going to stay positive, so positive 1/2, and that y value will be the negative version, or negative radical 3 over 2, okay? So sine of 5 pi over 3 is going to be negative radical 3 over 2, the y value. Cosine is going to be positive 1/2. Okay, tangent is y divided by x, so that's going to give me a negative radical 3. Okay. Cosecant is going to be 1 over this, or the reciprocal of sine, so it's going to give me negative 2 radical 3 over 3. Secant is going to be the reciprocal of 1/2, or 1 divided by 1/2, which is 2. And cotangent will be x divided by y, or the reciprocal of negative radical 3 here. So that's going to be negative radical 3 over 3, okay? And finally, 4 here, the real number is negative 3 pi. Well, hopefully we remember from previous videos and lessons that that's going to be at the terminal point, negative 1, 0, okay? That's on the left side of the x-axis, at negative 1, 0, okay? So these are a little bit easier to determine. Sine's going to be 0, cosine is going to be negative 1, tangent's going to be 0, okay? Cosecant's going to be undefined. Secant is going to be negative 1 as well. And then cotangent's going to be undefined, okay? So, again, moral of the story here. Make sure you determine the reference number or have the unit circle memorized. If you have the unit circle memorized, then it becomes a lot easier to come up with these terminal points. And once you have those terminal points, it's just a matter of understanding these 6 trig functions and the ratios that go along with those, okay? So that's how you determine the 6 trig functions for real numbers on the unit circle.